Business news now, and as Americans head to the ballot box for the nation's midterm elections, many tell pollsters that the economy is their greatest worry. Inflation remains stuck at above 8%, the highest in more than 40 years, with the cost of food and energy increasing even more quickly. But lawmakers can do little to directly influence inflation, and a divided Congress could further reduce America's room for economic maneuver. Well, let's return to London, where Arise correspondent Laurie Laird is still standing by for more on this and the rest of the day's business news, including a new court date for the irrepressible Elon Musk. Laurie, let's start with voting in America taking place against a backdrop of inflation at a 40-year high. Who does that favor?
I suspect it favors the Republicans, Charles, simply because the inflation happened on the watch of a Democrat. It happened at a time that Joe Biden was in office. Now, many people, Joe Biden may have inadvertently fueled inflation. Most of the inflation we're seeing has a lot to do with elevated energy prices, which has also fed through to food prices. But Joe Biden passed a very big stimulus plan within a couple of months of taking office in March of 2021. Many economists feel that that could have been the initial spark of inflation. The U.S. economy was recovering quite smartly at that point from the COVID recession. It probably didn't need that kind of stimulus at that point. So there is a little bit of scope for Republicans to throw these sorts of accusations against Joe Biden. But the biggest part of inflation has been arising from the war in Ukraine.
And we mentioned at the outset, Laurie, about whether or not Congress might have wiggle room when it comes to economic maneuver. Can they actually influence inflation?
And I think that's such an interesting point, Charles, because Joe Biden is being blamed for this 40-year high in inflation. And yes, there is on the margin, he has had some degree of responsibility there, but there isn't a great deal that Congress can do, particularly after inflation takes hold. It then becomes the job of the central bank, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has said that they intend to keep raising interest rates to fight inflation, which doesn't go down well with anybody who has debts or owns a house. But at this point, it really is the central bank that is the star of the show with trying to influence inflation.
And I mean, what should we expect? What can we expect if Republicans take control of either of the congressional chambers?
In short, we can expect gridlock. Very, very unlikely that any important economic legislation will go through. But I think the one thing that we have to be very, very wary of is the looming debt ceiling, reaching of the debt ceiling. By law, the U.S. government can only borrow to a certain amount. It's difficult to legislate to raise that debt ceiling, but it often becomes quite mired in politics. There was legislation to lift the debt ceiling twice under Joe Biden, 3 times under Donald Trump. It can be done, but it does get caught up in political infighting. And the Republicans, led by Congressman Kevin McCarthy, who seems to be eyeing the Speaker of the House chair, he has said plainly that he is willing to hold that debt ceiling to hostage if he can't get the Democrats to agree to some spending cuts. Hasn't said where those spending cuts would fall. Speculation, it could be Medicare, it could be Social Security. Some of these big universal assistance transfer payments could be at risk. But that is the biggest thing that we could possibly see, wrangling over the debt ceiling if that debt ceiling is not lifted. And many people think we'll hit it early next year, so there will have to be legislation. If there's no legislation to lift the debt ceiling, all of the federal government just grounds to a halt. There is absolutely no authorization of funding until that debt ceiling is lifted. So federal offices are closed. Veterans payments will be done. Social Security payments, medical payments for people in need. All that could very well just stop.
So the prospect of gridlock, potential issues with the debt ceiling, how are the markets reacting?
Surprisingly well, Charles. All of the stock markets are up a little bit more than 1% today. That's not a massive rally, but it's certainly quite robust. If you take away the prospect of the debt ceiling, if there is an assumption that somehow that will be handled, there'll be some agreement on it, markets rather like economic gridlock because it means there's not a whole lot of scope for surprises. It means the markets assume that there will be no massive economic legislation because the two parties won't be able to get along. And so there are no surprises. There wouldn't be any surprise tax rises, any surprise regulatory changes. So the markets are quite happy to see gridlock in Congress when it comes to economic affairs.
And before we go, Laurie, let's change gears. Another court date for your favorite person, Elon Musk.
Can you believe this, Charles? This is a lawsuit that has been filed by a shareholder in Tesla. So coming away from Twitter a little bit, he says that some of the incentives that were set to allow Elon Musk to collect a 54 billion, that's billion, Charles, not million, $1 billion pay packet that was assigned in 2018. He picked that up in 2019. The shareholder says that the performance, the incentives in that pay package were far too easy, agreed to by the board, and that the board is under Elon Musk's thumb. Just to add a little spice to this, the judge, we have a court date that was set very late last night. This will take place next week, this hearing. Presiding over this case, the exact judge who adjudicated in Elon Musk's Twitter case.
Well, we'll be watching that very closely. Laurie, thanks very much indeed. Laurie Laird, our business correspondent, talking to me from London there.